I'm going to take a slightly big cultural arc on this conversation because I think it's just useful. I'm going to briefly move straight here. I would like to put the thesis of property in a thesis of how we've constructed our relationship with the world. And the thesis I would want to put forward to you is that we constructed a language of humans being in dominion of the world. Being in dominion, in control of the world as a kind of narrative, as a faith, religious theory of how humans had control of the world. Off the back of that thesis of dominion, we constructed theses of perspective. Perspective created distance. It also allowed us to create actually theories of control, kings, and the birth of perspective. In that theory, we also created the thesis of separation. We separated ourselves from the world, and that agency of separation also allowed us to create objectification, to turn things into objects rather than perceiving them as entanglements in relationship with. And off the back of that, that allowed us to actually build classification theory, actually the separation, race, for example. All of these were classification modalities to permit a framework of violence, and it also dominated our language shifts, dominated from moving from verb-orientated to noun-orientated relationships. So we increasingly, the world started to be noun-orientated. And in that finality, I think we moved into a thesis of property as a universal means of organizing. And I would put forward to you as a challenge that employment and labor is actually just an extension of a theory of property. And it's part of a theory, and I would talk at people like Ruth Gilmore's work, which talks about fundamentally all of our world has been constructed through theories of control and punishment models. And property is an enslavement of things, asymmetric enslavement of things in the way we've organized the world. And it's allowed us to build this worldview. It's allowed us to build this worldview. However, I think the challenge we're facing is that worldview no longer works because our entanglements are no longer ignorable. This is just one piece of data. You can pick any forms of data. The entanglements of the world are now so material and visceral, whether it's climate change, whether it's mycotoxins, our entanglements are so visceral and real that we require a new response to our relationship with the world. And I think what I would put forth to you is that we're in a 1 in a 400-year transformation of our relationship to the world. Our relationship with the world has been on dominion and asymmetric control, and I think we have to operationalize ourselves in a new theory of entanglement. And that means we have to move towards living in life-affirming societies. And by extension of life, and this is building directly of Ruth Gilmore's work, right, life-affirming infrastructures, to life-affirming societies where we extend the theory of life not just to humans and non-humans, but also machine systems. So we go, how do you build life-affirming societies which go fully expansive? And life means that we have to challenge theories of property, labor, all of these things that have been constructed as mechanisms of control. How do we operationalize that? That allows us, if I was to be challenging, to move into a different modality of operating in a theory of entanglement. And you'll notice we haven't just put in those diagrams just humans and sort of trees. We're expanding the thesis of life to actually agent-based systems, so at the re-agentification of the world. So we're moving from asset modality to everything becoming an agent. Animism. All of that expansion is now possible because actually we've changed our bureaucratic frameworks from being outside control orientation to developmental orientation. And that opens up a whole new framework of starting to look at expanding our relationships in the world, expanding our theories of citizenship, all the things, and you're starting to see some of these things already happen. Whether we're expanding the rights of nature, we're starting to see mountains becoming self-sovereign or actually becoming agents in the world. How do we start to expand that? And obviously this builds on history. Some great examples of this stuff, and again, I point to Fang and Calvin's work. They've been doing some brilliant work around this stuff of how we expand our theory of actually how we relate to objects and materiality in radical new ways. And that opens up a different conversation. So this is where the difference comes in. I'm not sure it's about going back to cooperatives and commons, and I would be critical, and I think people like, actually the work of Ahlstrom is great for closed, bounded systems, but in an unbounded system, actually commons becomes very difficult to manage, and most of our problems in an entangled world are unbounded entanglement problems, where we have to start to think about the world differently. And I would argue that what we're going to see is the re-agentification of the world, where we expand the theory of citizenship in the world to things and non-things, and start to talk about how we behave in a different way. And that's not going back to a commoning world, but actually the re-agentification of the world, which is an alternative thesis. And that you can expand. How am I doing for time? Okay, that you can expand to all sorts of things, whether it's a forest, sure. A building, and I think other people are doing brilliant work on this. We're doing some work on houses becoming self-owning, all the way to, controversially, what happens if a camera is self-sovereign? And the question you have to ask yourself is, when the camera becomes self-sovereign, does it become in relationship of care? And then how do you build a technology which is actually life-affirming as opposed to extractive and actually building extractive power? So this is not just a paradigm of ownership, it's a paradigm then of relationship. And the paradigm of relationship starts to actually fundamentally challenge, well, what is a relationship of technology in relationship of care to an environment or place in radical formats? Now, I've taken a big art conversation. There are brilliant people at DM who are doing some really practical stuff, but I just wanted to introduce a slightly different arc to the conversation, and I think none of these are truths, by the way. It's a perspective to be introduced and hopefully have a good conversation with. And I think when you start to go down that perspective, it starts to challenge foundational ideas, like the languages that we use, the way we relate to rivers, and stewardship relationships in radical formats. So what does that worldview look like in the 21st century when every being, everything is a becoming, is a developmental model? Everything is becoming, but also in relationship to. So my intelligence is not my own, but it's in a relationship to each other. And then everything is actually in the process of being entangled in that process. So interbecomings, everything becomes an interbecoming. What does that worldview look like, and how do you re-agentify the world in a radical format? Bang. Time.